You weren't too much. You weren't too emotional. You weren't too intense. You were just hard to control. And for someone who survives on confusion, clarity feels threatening. For someone who relies on mixed signals, boundaries feel aggressive. For someone who manipulates subtly, self-respect feels dangerous. So they didn't say, "You're hard to manipulate." They said, "You're difficult. You're too sensitive. You overthink. You expect too much." And for a while, you believed them. But here's the truth. You weren't hard to love. You were hard to play with. Let's reframe this properly. Manipulation only works where self-doubt lives. It needs confusion. It needs inconsistency. It needs you questioning yourself. And you stop questioning yourself. That's when the energy shifted. You asked direct questions. You noticed patterns. You remembered what was said. You didn't laugh off disrespect. You didn't romanticize inconsistency. You didn't ignore red flags. Because of chemistry, that doesn't make you difficult. That makes you aware. But awareness disrupts. People who benefit from your blindness. When someone is used to soft boundaries and flexible standards, your firmness feels foreign. When someone thrives on emotional ambiguity, your clarity feels confrontational. You didn't become harder to love. You became harder to confuse. And confusion is a powerful control tactic. If someone can keep you guessing, they keep you attached. If someone can make you insecure, they keep you performing. If someone can destabilize you, they keep you chasing. But you stopped chasing. You stopped over-explaining. You stopped absorbing blame just to maintain connection. And when you did, the dynamic collapsed. Not because you failed, because manipulation requires access, and you revoked it. Rejection hits differently. When you think you were too much, but it feels empowering. When you realize you were simply unavailable for emotional games. You weren't rejected for being unlovable. You were dismissed because you were unmanageable. And unmanageable women make immature people uncomfortable. Let that land. You were not difficult. You were discerning. You were not dramatic. You were direct. You were not demanding. You were clear. Clarity feels like pressure to someone hiding intention, and pressure reveals character. Let's go deeper, because this wasn't random. There is a pattern to why emotionally manipulative people label strong women as hard to love. It protects their ego. It protects their control. And most importantly, it protects them from accountability. Manipulation is subtle. It rarely looks evil. It looks charming, attentive, intense, fast. It creates closeness quickly. It mirrors your values. It studies your wounds. It learns your language. And then, it slowly shifts the ground beneath you. Not all at once. Gradually. A delayed reply here. A dismissive joke there. A "you're overreacting" when you express discomfort. A withdrawal of warmth when you assert a boundary. Tiny destabilizations. Just enough to make you question yourself. Because once you question yourself, you are easier to guide, easier to steer, easier to silence. But you didn't silence yourself. You noticed the shift. You named it. You asked about it. And instead of shrinking, you held eye contact. That's when the narrative changed. Not the behavior. The narrative. Suddenly you were intense. Suddenly you were too analytical. Suddenly you were hard work. But let's decode that. Too analytical means you remember patterns. Too sensitive means you notice tone. Hard work means you require consistency. None of that is unlovable. It's just incompatible with manipulation. Manipulation thrives in gray areas, in blurred lines, in undefined commitments. You don't thrive there anymore. You ask direct questions. What are we? What do you want? Why did you say that? Directness forces clarity, and clarity forces truth. Truth is inconvenient for someone who benefits from your uncertainty. So instead of rising, they retreat. Instead of adjusting, they accuse. Instead of taking responsibility, they redefine you as the problem. Because if you are too much, they don't have to grow. If you are too difficult, they don't have to show up differently. If you are hard to love, they don't have to examine their emotional limitations. Projection is powerful. It transfers discomfort from them onto you. And if you're not grounded, you'll carry it. You'll start softening. You'll start explaining more. You'll start proving you're easy. Easy to please. Easy to calm. Easy to keep. But here's what changed. You stopped proving. You stopped performing flexibility. You stopped pretending. Confusion didn't bother you. And in doing so, you removed the leverage. Leverage only exists when someone can destabilize you. You became stable, and stability cannot be manipulated easily. Emotionally manipulative people often seek responsiveness, big reactions, emotional swings, reassurance cycles. You stopped giving that, not out of spite, out of self-regulation. You felt the urge to react, to defend, to argue your case. But you paused. You breathed. You responded once, calmly. That calm is disarming because manipulation depends on emotional activation. When you don't activate, the tactic fails. And when the tactic fails, the manipulator feels exposed. Exposure feels like rejection to someone who hides behind charm. So they flip the script. You're guarded. You don't trust. You're not easy to love. But what they mean is, you are not easy to influence. You are not easy to guilt. You are not easy to destabilize. And that threatens control. Here's another layer. Manipulative dynamics often rely on imbalance. One person overinvests, the other underdelivers. One person explains, the other withdraws. One person apologizes, the other deflects. You used to overinvest. You used to compensate. You used to bridge the gaps. And that created a false harmony. When you stopped compensating, the imbalance became obvious. An obvious imbalance is uncomfortable for them, not for you, because now you see it clearly. You are no longer flattered by intensity without consistency. You are no longer impressed by words without action. You are no longer seduced by potential without accountability. That makes you selective. And selectivity reduces access. Reduced access feels like rejection to someone used to easy entry. But access to you is not a right. It's earned. You didn't become high maintenance. You became high awareness. And awareness changes the entire dynamic. You don't argue about facts. You don't debate patterns. You don't negotiate disrespect. You observe. You adjust. You disengage if necessary. That quiet disengagement is powerful because it removes supply, and manipulative patterns require supply. Supply of attention, supply of emotional reaction, supply of doubt. You no longer supply doubt. You trust your perception. That trust makes you untouchable in ways they can't tolerate. So they leave, or they try one last tactic. Guilt. You changed. You're not the same. You used to be softer. Yes, you did change. You stopped confusing softness with self-abandonment. You stopped equating tolerance with love. You stopped believing that understanding someone's trauma required tolerating their behavior. That evolution disqualified you from certain dynamics. And that's not rejection. That's filtering. The wrong people will call your boundaries. Walls. The wrong people will call your standards. Demands. The wrong people will call your clarity. Conflict. But the right people will call it relief. Because secure love doesn't fear accountability, it welcomes it. Secure love doesn't crumble under directness, it responds to it. Secure love doesn't need you confused to stay connected, it needs you grounded. So when someone labeled you hard to love, pause. Ask yourself quietly, was I hard to love? Or was I hard to manipulate? Did I demand perfection? Or did I demand consistency? Did I ask for fantasy? Or did I ask for honesty? Most of the time, you were simply unwilling to play small, to keep someone comfortable. You were unwilling to silence your intuition, to protect their ego. You were unwilling to pretend not to see what was obvious. And that unwillingness is strength, not difficulty. Strength. You were never too much. You were calibrated. You were not unlovable. You were incompatible with immaturity. And incompatibility is not rejection, it's protection. Here's the part no one talks about. When manipulation fails, it doesn't quietly disappear, it escalates. Because control is not just behavior, it is ego protection. When someone realizes they can't bend you, they don't immediately reflect. They resist. They reframe you as the problem. They call you cold, unreachable, guarded, too independent. But independence only threatens someone who benefits from your dependency. Pay attention to that. When you stopped reacting to silent treatments, they intensified them. When you stopped explaining yourself for having boundaries, they accused you of changing. When you stopped overgiving, they called you selfish. That wasn't random. That was a failed system trying to reset. Because manipulation is a pattern. It has steps: charm, connection, inconsistency, confusion, emotional withdrawal, blame shift, then temporary affection. To keep you attached, you recognized the pattern. You interrupted it. And interruption feels like betrayal to someone who expected access. This is why rejection often comes right after you gain clarity, not before. When you were unsure, they were comfortable. When you were anxious, they felt secure. When you were chasing, they felt chosen. But when you stood still, they felt exposed. Because standing still forces truth to surface. It forces effort or exit. And immature people often choose exit when effort is required. Not because you are hard to love, because loving you requires integrity. And integrity cannot coexist with manipulation. Let's go deeper. People who manipulate are not always villains. Sometimes they are emotionally underdeveloped. Sometimes they learned early that control equals safety. Sometimes they equate love with power dynamics. But understanding that does not mean tolerating it. Compassion does not require self-sacrifice. And maturity does not require you to shrink so someone else feels big. When you stopped shrinking, you didn't become unlovable. You became equal. And equality is uncomfortable for someone who prefers advantage. Here is the shift that changed everything for you. You stopped negotiating your standards. You stopped proving your worth. You stopped auditioning for consistency. You stopped accepting bare minimum as potential. That is not hardness. That is evolution. But evolution creates distance from those who refuse to grow. They may say, "You've changed," and they are right. You changed your tolerance level. You changed your response patterns. You changed what you romanticize. You changed how long you wait for someone to choose you. And that shift removes you from the manipulation cycle entirely. Because the cycle requires emotional reactivity. It requires you to panic when they pull away, to overcompensate when they criticize, to overinvest when they withdraw. You didn't panic. You observed. You didn't overcompensate. You recalibrated. You didn't overinvest. You matched energy. That's when they realized you were no longer manageable. This is the psychology of why strong women get labeled difficult. Strength without aggression confuses manipulators. Calm without compliance threatens them. Boundaries without drama expose them. You didn't yell. You didn't beg. You didn't collapse. You simply withdrew access. And withdrawal of access is the loudest boundary you can set, because now they cannot control the narrative inside your mind. They cannot twist events. If you don't seek their validation, they cannot gaslight. If you trust your perception, gaslighting only works when you doubt yourself. You stop doubting yourself. And that's when the relationship destabilized, not because love was absent, but because power shifted. And some people do not want partnership. They want leverage. You were never hard to love. You were hard to dominate emotionally. You were hard to guilt, hard to silence, hard to emotionally corner. And that is threatening to someone who equates intimacy with control. Let's address something deeper. Rejection hurts most when it triggers old wounds. Maybe you grew up being told you were too sensitive, too expressive, too strong, too opinionated. So when someone walks away, after you assert yourself, it feels like confirmation. But it is not confirmation. It is filtration. You filtered out someone who required a smaller version of you, and smaller versions may attract more people, but they cost you yourself. You chose alignment over approval, and alignment sometimes reduces access, but it increases peace, and peace is not negotiable anymore. Here's the quiet truth. The right person will not call your boundaries walls. They will call them clarity. They will not interpret your standards as ego. They will see them as self-awareness. They will not feel intimidated by your emotional intelligence. They will feel relieved, because healthy people do not want to manage confusion. They want transparency. They want consistency. They want mutual respect. And mutual respect cannot grow in a space where one person benefits from imbalance. So if someone walked away, when you stop tolerating chaos, let that be information, not indictment. Information. They were comfortable with the old dynamic, not the evolved you. And evolution always exposes who was attached to your wounds instead of your wholeness. You were never hard to love. You were hard to manipulate. And that difference changes everything. Here's the final shift. You have to stop grieving people who only wanted access to your confusion. Read that again. Not access to your heart, not access to your depth, access to your confusion. Because confusion kept you flexible. Confusion kept you forgiving. Confusion kept you available to dynamics that never fully chose you. And the moment you became clear, you became inconvenient. Clear women are inconvenient to emotionally immature men. Clear women are inconvenient to inconsistent lovers. Clear women are inconvenient to anyone who benefits from blurred lines. You didn't lose someone because you were hard to love. You lost someone because you stopped tolerating being emotionally toyed with. And here's the truth. That sets you free. The kind of person who calls you difficult for having boundaries was never looking for intimacy. They were looking for leverage. Intimacy requires presence. Leverage requires imbalance. Intimacy requires honesty. Leverage requires confusion. Intimacy requires accountability. Leverage requires blame shifting. You were offering intimacy. They were operating in leverage. That mismatch is not incompatibility. It is misalignment in emotional maturity. And misalignment will always feel like rejection before it feels like protection. At first, you internalize it. Maybe I should have been softer. Maybe I should have waited longer. Maybe I should have ignored that. Maybe I should have tried harder. But notice something. Every maybe requires you to shrink, to tolerate more, to silence intuition, to accept less. That's not growth. That's regression. You are not here to be digestible. You are here to be aligned. And alignment does not beg for acceptance. It attracts resonance. The right person will not experience your clarity as pressure. They will experience it as safety, because mature love does not thrive in confusion. It thrives in consistency. It thrives in direct communication. It thrives in mutual effort. And when you finally understand that you were never hard to love, just hard to manipulate, your entire nervous system shifts. You stop chasing closure from people who benefited from your self-doubt. You stop explaining yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you. You stop negotiating your standards to maintain connection. You stop proving what should be obvious, and something powerful happens. You become calm, not bitter, not defensive, calm, because you no longer interpret their inability as your inadequacy. You interpret it as their limitation. That is emotional maturity. That is self-respect. That is power. Without aggression, you don't need revenge. You don't need validation. You don't need them to admit they couldn't handle you. Your peace is proof enough. Your standards are proof enough. Your detachment is proof enough. And here's the empowering truth. The more you heal, the fewer people will feel comfortable around you. Because healed women cannot be emotionally steered. They cannot be guilt into staying. They cannot be confused into commitment. They cannot be breadcrumbed into loyalty. And the right man won't want to steer you. He won't want to guilt you. He won't want to confuse you. He will want to meet you as an equal. So if someone walked away after you stood firm, after you asked for clarity, after you stopped tolerating games, understand something deeply. You didn't lose love. You lost manipulation disguised as love. And that is not a loss. That is liberation. Now here's the question. Are you willing to stop apologizing for being emotionally intelligent? Are you willing to stop shrinking to make someone else comfortable? Are you willing to trust that being hard to manipulate is actually the safest place you can be? If this resonated, if you felt seen, don't just nod quietly. Own it. Comment aligned. Let this be the moment you stop internalizing what was never yours. Share this with the woman who still thinks she was too much. She needs to hear this. And if you're ready for more conversations that protect your peace and sharpen your standards, subscribe to Depth of Us. Because here, we don't teach you how to be chosen. We remind you, you are not here to be played with.